Well, good day, everybody. My name is Jason Stella, as you know, and I'm the host of the Lifetime Training Podcast, and I am happy to bring you today Mr. Anthony Carey. Anthony has been in this industry for years and years and years, holds a master's degree in biomechanics and athletic training. He's been recognized as a leading expert in biomechanics, corrective exercise, functional anatomy, motor control, and those relationships with pain, and founded a company in 1994, which is a studio in San Diego called Function First, and has been nominated and won Personal Trainer of the Year several times, and was a finalist in Ideas Personal Trainer of the Year. So welcome, Anthony. Thanks for coming on the show.
Awesome to be with you, my friend.
Thanks. Well, I know as we've known each other for a while here, and as I've seen you kind of build your brand up, a lot of it has been focused around helping people with pain. And I'd love for you to, really that's going to be the topic of this episode today, is just how you've been able to navigate that, and really why, what got you started in that particular area. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience, how did you come to, focus on the pain in this industry and then evolve into what you've, evolved into?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably fair to say exclusively working with people in pain is what I've done since we started Function First in 1994. Actually, after graduate school, doing the whole sports medicine thing with the athletic training, learning all the traditional pathologies and kind of the contemporary wisdom of how you would work with injuries at that time, and more the acute, less of the chronic stuff. Coming out of graduate school, I had the opportunity to work for a few years with a guy named Peter Goskew, who actually really influenced my sort of the lens from which I viewed the body through. He was definitely ahead of his time then, and was just looking more globally at the body. If anything, I would say that was the most influential thing that caused a bit of a pivot in my career at that time. And just like many young people, myself and a couple of my colleagues at the time felt we could build a better mousetrap, and we left and did our own thing and started Function First in 1994. Yeah. And like I like to say that we were using the word function long before it became, part of the
cliche,
right? And overused for that matter. But the idea of working with people in chronic pain versus the sprained ankle or the torn rotator cuff type thing from playing tennis over the weekend was really a sort of this intriguing puzzle to solve, right? Because first of all, outside of the scope, even with my graduate degree, outside of my scope to treat anybody. Yep. In a traditional sense. So we were very often seeing people sort of after they've been there, done that kind of thing, right? They've been with traditional therapies, even surgeries, chiropractic, all that kind of stuff. And so now you were looking at this, okay, instead of like zooming in on that spot that hurts, what if we just took a giant step backwards and thought about how we could create this environment more where the body could heal itself if we sort of dissipated a lot of the mechanical stress that was either leading to the chronicity of that injury or sort of the repetitive cumulative stress on that area that was keeping it part of the forefront. So, I mean, that's always intrigued me, and the reward side of that from, as a professional and what you're able to help with people with is just off the charts.
Yeah, and that's it. I followed a similar path in that I dealt with more injury and focused on golfers. That was my niche. And I think it's important, especially for the trainers that are, either struggling or the trainers that are up and coming in the industry, to understand the importance of how, really being able to focus on, an area that will pay. I mean, you help people, and again, you can't fix pain. We'll get into that, or you can't treat the pain. We'll get into how what you can do a little bit later, but it's so important. Obviously, financially, people will pay whatever it is, especially if they, like you said, have gone down that pathway of trying everything and anything, and they're still in pain. I mean, people will pay, and then they'll refer, and, it goes on from there. So I love that and really appreciate that as well. And, one of the things too, I'd like to bring up is, there's so many different ways to go about helping people. You've won Egoscue. I went down muscle activation technique and some of the other things that are out there. And they all have their place. They all work. And if they don't, then we move on to the next. But at the end of the day, it's not about, defending a guru. It's about taking the information and then working with people. And if you're helping people, then that's what works. And, some people just get brain dead right when they hear a certain thing and they shut down and they don't listen to anything. And I think that's important to highlight.
Yeah, and I think part of what has guided us and it has been we've looked at more of it as an approach versus like a method, right? So the method becomes you sort of it becomes self-limiting. You put unnecessary guardrails on what you do, and since 1994, I can honestly say that we've evolved quite a bit, and
Yep.
I've been influenced by others. You know, Pete was the first one to make that shift, but you know, lots of people that you and I know really well have influenced me in different ways, and then I'll grab bits and pieces and how do I massage that into what we do.
Yep.
So that approach is always evolving based on the science, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Great. Well, can you share with the audience, you know, you've written a great book. I got it right here. That's called The Pain-Free Program, Proven Method to Relieve Back, Neck, Shoulder, and Joint Pain. And, you know, I guess, I'd love for you to kind of talk about how do you work with pain to start? I mean, there's other things we'll dive into in the book, but how do you help people in pain given you're an athletic trainer or even a personal trainer?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is reinforce the fact that, you know, we don't treat, we don't diagnose, right? And even from what I do in terms of our approach, like I was describing, is completely hands off. And the value in that versus the value in hands-on, the value in hands-off is that you've empowered somebody to take something with them that they can reproduce on a daily basis on their own. And of course, they're also empowered in the event they have episodes where they can do something for themselves at the time. But you know, from the 30,000 foot view, it's how do we remove mechanical stress from the body and dissipate it? And by doing that, you actually scramble, you know, how the nervous system and then ultimately the brain perceives threat or lack of threat, right? So you give the structures and the tissue a chance to heal, but at the same time, the brain no longer recognizes a familiar threat. And that ultimately influences both the physiological, psychological, and even social response to that input.
Yeah. And I think a key there that you said is how to dissipate it. We're not necessarily we're removing it from an area that's getting too much of it is what I think I heard you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's important. It's not like, you know, somebody will take what you said there and go, oh, the forces are going through our body all the time. Yes. What we're saying is when forces go through a specific part of the body and they get clogged up and they continue to go and then that tissue becomes overused and, you know, and then starts to create dysfunction and all the other things that can happen. That's what we're talking about. And that's what you've been able to work with.
Sure. And you could just assume anything biological in nature has a tolerance, right? Well, even anything non-biological, even a metal or steel has a tolerance, right? So whether it's a joint surface or whether it's the soft tissue you described, even if it's blood vessels for that matter, you know, it has a tolerance. And after a certain point, okay, it's going to fill certain nerve receptors that are going to say, this is noxious, this is bad, all right? It's a threat. And so how do we perceive that and how do we dissipate that? But yeah, again, as a system, stress is actually good for us. Mechanical stress is good for us.
In one of the quotes in the book, I want to read it. It says, one of my key philosophies is to focus on the function of the individual's body rather than attempting to treat or fix what hurts. Would you mind going into depth, on what do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, let's just take lower back pain, right? Probably more than half the people watching this, and it's like 8.5 out of 10 people in the industrialized world have it, right? So especially as trainers, because we're givers, right? Somebody comes in with a back pain, we're like, oh, I've got a great stretch for that back, or you've got to strengthen your core, or whatever it is, right? But what if we said, hey, the back is just the response, right? The back is telling you, the pain in the back is telling you something, right? It's not necessarily that the back in and of itself is the villain or the bad guy in all this. That's just where it's talking. So sometimes the best thing to do is not do anything for the area that hurts, especially if, depending on how acute they are outside scope of practice, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So you take a step back and you look like, let me watch you walk, let me watch you squat, let me look a little bit at your posture, let me see how you turn. Whatever those movement assessments are that you're comfortable with, how does that lead to an accumulation and a familiarity, again, with what the nervous system and the brain perceive as, where the danger is or what's familiar. So you take that step back, you say, hey, this ankle could do a little bit better that, and that ankle's feeding this hip that, so we're gonna make sure that both of these are doing something a little bit better. Or maybe there's a little bit of tissue release here or there or something like that. But you could look at, I often use this analogy with clients. We can have two identical twins that come in, right? And they both have identical dysfunctions in the way they move. One of them has pain and one of them doesn't.
Yeah.
Why not? Well, it has as much to do with many factors other than just their structure. But the structure is the way that, as an exercise professional, and as the body recognizes confidence, is how we can infiltrate that system and make the movement. Ultimately, we have to move, right? Yeah. To participate in our environments, we have to move. So whether you put them on a table, whether you Theragun or hypervolt them, or whether you foam roll them, or whether you massage them, or whether you manipulate a joint, at the end of the day, that person's got to move.
Yep.
Right. So if we help them move better by exercise, we've expedited that process.
Well, and I think that's the big thing too, that I think the quote was getting across too, is that typically where the pain is and where the problem is are usually not the same thing. And a lot of times we can argue that the tissues where the pain is the tissues that have been overused over and over and over again, which is what's causing some of that. So how can I, like you said in the beginning, or we said in the beginning, is dissipate those forces to get more tissues to handle that load, and then, or take the load away from it, and then that stuff goes away. So that's where within biomechanics, obviously you need to understand biomechanics, and in an hour podcast, we can't go into a huge in-depth thing on biomechanics, but at the end of the day, that's the importance of it. And understanding how to, if we can fix the mechanics, some of that pain might go away. Just like if a car's out of alignment and we put it back into alignment, we can get some more wear and tear on the car or on the tires.
And you're also, by dissipating the stress, you're also giving the body a window of opportunity to do what it does best, which is to heal itself, right?
Yeah.
So if I get a bruise on my elbow, and every time I sit down at the desk on my computer 25 times in a day, I bang that bruise, it's not going to heal, right?
Mm-hmm.
That might be a little bit exaggerated and acute in nature, but the sort of the underlying principle is the same, right? If I keep rubbing those facets like that all the time, you're just going to bark back at me, right?
Something's going to happen. Yep. So there's a bunch of concepts that are fantastic in the book that I'd love to spend some time on. And, one of the things is the body's interrelatedness. You have a section on that. Can you go into what that means and maybe an example of how that applies to a trainer?
Well, it goes back to a little bit of what we just talked about, which is sort of how do you take that step back, right? And you look at the kind of the global relationship of the parts, right? And realizing that, so an analogy I'll often use for my clients, again, as I'm doing an intake is, if we were to evaluate them, we'd say, okay, your ankle's doing this, your hip could use some help with that, your thoracic spine could use a little help with that. It's not like we give, here's ankle exercises, here's hip exercises, and here's thoracic spine exercises, right? Because then you're actually disregarding the interdependency of all that, or the relationship of it all. And then if we realize that from a, some of the folks listening might be familiar with the 80-20 principle, and I know you do a lot of personal growth stuff, so you're familiar with that. We're going to get 80% of our results from 20% of our input, right? If I can influence a couple of key big rocks, so to speak, in the process, I'm going to get a positive cascade in that movement pattern that I'm looking for. But if I try to zero in on just certain things, then I'm sort of missing the big picture or the interrelatedness of the body.
Got it.
And if we do that, the body is often just needs a little kick in the butt to go in the right direction.
Yeah, and I know a little bit later in the podcast we're going to go into some exercises that might be able to show exactly what you mean there. And I guess that feeds into the next concept of the body. Our self-healing bodies is another section of the book, and can you expand on what we've already discussed and how that applies?
Sure. So especially the pain science now is significantly evolved, even from the time that book was published, is significantly evolved. And matter of fact, as a side note, all those exercises in the book continue to work well. But there's been a bit of a change in the narrative a little bit as the pain science has really evolved around it. But everything from self-healing means if you give the body the opportunity to heal. Okay, so let me backtrack for a second. The way that we view pain now, right, is through three lenses. The paradigm is a biopsychosocial model, right? And You may have heard of it. So bio is everything that we've always thought about, and basically what we've been discussing for the most part here. It's your biomechanics, it's your biology, your biophysiology, your biochemistry. It's the inflammation, it's the wear and tear, it's all that stuff, right? But the psychological is also, how does the brain perceive that input, right? So again, going back to that word I used earlier, is a threat. If it interprets input, because basically, if I stick a pen in your thigh right now, all that is data, right? Meaning it's got to travel up to the brain, and the brain has to say, dude, he's nuts, that's dangerous. First thing you're going to do is withdraw and retract, right? Because that doesn't go to the brain, it only goes to the spinal cord and back out. Yep. Then you're going to go, what the?
I'm laughing because I'm laughing because I've got that scene in Talladega Nights when Will Ferrell thinks he's paralyzed, and he takes I think it's a knife or something. He just stabs himself right into the leg, and he jumps up. Ah!
There you go. There you go. But it's just an example of how influential the brain is, right? And so if the brain starts to recognize all that, so that it ties into, so what are our beliefs, what are our expectations? So Will Ferrell knew that was going to hurt, right? He already knew it because he had a point of reference. He either seen it or experienced something like that before. Our attitudes about healing, right? It's our expectations, all those kind of things. And then the the social side is basically how does what our experiences, how is that influenced by social pressures, right? So let's say you're the only income generator for your family, right? And we hit hard times, and now your back goes out, and you can't work for 3 weeks. Well, that added stress influences your entire response and your experience physiologically as well. And so you can't separate the three of them. It's like a three-legged stool. So with that, it means so everything. When we talk about working with people in chronic pain, you've got to take the mechanical stress off them, right? But you also have to educate them and coach them through a little bit of understanding the process that goes on. So then you get into, sleep habits, you get into diet, you get into hydration, you get into having a good social network, you get into being able to have somebody to talk to and support, and all that kind of stuff, all plays a role in it. And
yeah. Well, and again, the next point is the need to take responsibility. And I think you were just talking about some of that, but if you wouldn't mind going a little bit deeper on what you mean by that.
For sure. So going back to what we talked about in terms of cost, right? Or what we can, so people come to see me, number one, I charge a lot of money. Number two, they're almost always referred by somebody else who's always been there. So right away, that gives me leverage. Leverage in that they know that I have an expectation, and they already know if they've been referred, but the expectation is they're going to do their homework, right? So somebody comes to see me and they have a great session, right? And their pain goes from a 9 on a scale of 1 to 10 to a 1 or a 0, and they walk out the door and they're like, oh my gosh, like Oscar De La Hoya did. If you saw, saw that, he gets on his social media. Yeah. But if he doesn't continue with that, or that person doesn't continue with that, it's not permanent, right? I didn't wave the magic wand. It wasn't me who did it. It was actually him who did it, which means he has to do it again tomorrow and the next day.
Yeah.
Right. So the responsibility, by placing that onus of responsibility on the individual, they realize that, okay, I've got to take care of me. Okay? And if I don't take care of me, I'll just keep going to somebody else and paying money for the rest of my life. But it's also, the lack of responsibility is also a way of disempowering themselves, right? So they can, so if it's been a work injury, or if it's been because they have a lousy relationship or whatever it is, they can start to blame other things and not take, at the end of the day, until you take responsibility, okay, you'll have a finite level of improvement that you'll experience.
Well, and I think a lot of times people don't put it all together, don't understand how some of those things that are happening on the outside impact them. I think it's more popular now where people understand what they're feeding themselves is going to create what they feel like to a certain extent as well. I remember vividly for, I think the rest of my life, I'm scarred by this. I had learned some things. A guy had shoulder pain. He was an ex-Marine, and his core was just completely dysfunctional and wasn't firing in the tests that I was using. And I tried explaining to him that, who, by the way, he went to Cairo, he went to all these other guys and nothing was working. So now he's here in front of me. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of dysfunction in your trunk and in your core. And that's the reason why you may be having some shoulder pain. He literally looked at me. He said, "You're full of BS," and he walked out. He goes, "There's no way that my abs and my core can impact, what's going on in my shoulder." I was just like, "See you later, brother. I know you haven't been helped by anybody. At least give it a try. I'll do it for free for a session just to see if you feel any better." So, but yeah, putting it together.
Beliefs, right?
Yeah.
That's the psychological aspect of it as
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah,
People
for
believe,
sure.
if he believes it's a shoulder thing and it's only a shoulder thing, then that's the direction he's going to take in trying to resolve it.
Yeah.
Until he runs out of options.
Yeah. Well, and it sounded like he did, but who knows what happened. So, I know you've got a kind of a unique way of putting together exercises into groups in the book, and you have them form and category. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to explain some of those, what is form, what is category, and then maybe even show a couple of the exercises that, maybe somebody can take away and potentially use.
Yeah. Well, if you think about the sort of the objective of the book, it was really to take the entire human population and put them into 6 categories, right? So
Okay.
ultimately the book is a self-help book. It's a way that you can look at some postural, which would be the forms, look at some postural, identify with certain postural characteristics. Mm-hmm. And if that's you, then here's some associated exercises, which at the time was a big departure from, you got back pain, do these back exercises, you get shoulder pain. It was a way that people, and they could also choose a category based on how they spent most of their day, right? So the difference between the person that sat at the computer all day and the person that's a landscaper are completely different in responsibility. So we try to put together exercises along those, with those kind of parameters based on what the user would do.
And I think that, and thanks for clarifying that and how that was done. I would love, if we can, obviously there's more Zoom meetings, there's more FaceTime, my kid plays soccer and then he's playing whatever game on the computer and I'm talking about his posture. So I would love, if you wouldn't mind, maybe if there's something that, you can give to the group that they can use and take away with around, hey, somebody who's sitting in front of a camera, watching Zoom calls all day long, kind of rounded shoulder, forward head, those types of things. What can they expect, or what's a good exercise?
Well, there's quite a few.
Yeah, no, I know that.
And keep in mind if there's, and I'm happy to show a couple too. It's kind of fun, especially for the fitness pros, et cetera, that are on here, is also to sort of apply a few principles to them. And if you can apply a few principles, and they can grab from this as well.
Yep.
And start to apply. I mean, sort of the baseline, and which is kind of an AASM thing, is kind of release the tight and strengthen the back. It's not our approach actually at all. We don't do it that way. And matter of fact,
and you said, and I'm sorry, Anthony, it kind of stuttered there on the internet connection. I apologize. You said that's not your approach.
That is not our approach. Yeah, we don't do the release or active lengthen and then activate or that sort of thing. It's
okay.
Ours is based on actually on the what we would consider the levels of difficulty neurologically in relationship to gravity. We might start with what looks like a strengthening exercise, but neurologically, actually, what it's doing is down-regulating some other muscles by doing that sort of. It's designed to create some sort of hip or pelvic shift or T-spine stuff. So there's, if folks are sitting at the computer all day, number one rule is variability, right? Which is my other bag of interest with CORE TEX and everything. But that's basically, give the body just variations of ways. There's no perfect posture, right? There's the ability to get in and out of postures and increase mechanical stress. But then as it comes to exercises to do generally, like if somebody is significantly flexed all day, and this is a principle that I'll be sharing, is that what's the intuitive thing for all of us to do? This is somebody's thoracic spine. It's let's try to extend them, right?
Yep.
Guess what that says to the nervous system? It says, hey, idiot, let's do something you hate to do, you resist to do, you're not very good at to do, but because I'm such a smart trainer, I'm going to make you do this. Right?
And this is the way it would be.
It's all this. We've all done it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what the client even thinks of themselves too. They just want to do this. But what if we said, well, if we actually come in and do a little something like this first, that actually happens to be coupled with extension. right? So we can do a little side bend and then a little gentle rotation. Then we sneak up on the extension. So the nervous system doesn't immediately put up its, forget that, right? It says, hey, what are you doing down there, Jason? It feels kind of nice. It's not so scary. It's not so stressful, right? And so you start to introduce a little bit of that. Sure, ultimately we want to get to something where we're asking that pure extension. But if we come at it and sneak up on it on different ways, we've actually kind of using novelty, which is another key principle that we have, using a little bit of novelty, the nervous system doesn't recognize it as a threat. Right? So some of what we often see with people like that, it's not just that the tissue is locked like that. Sure, it's probably shorter here and longer here. But as soon as you try to do anything, the nervous system dials up even more tension that's going to hold it in place, right? So we got to just hold a little bit. And I say, ask, don't tell the body.
Yeah, and we could, we can kind of merge these things together. We're going to talk about it a little later, but that in essence, and I want to hear the story of how you came up with, inventing the CORE TEX, which is something that you won. I believe it was product of the year in overseas, correct?
Well, I won an innovation award for Idea China in 2020, which was a combination of how we take the research and put it into our teachings and our products. Yeah.
Got it. So
and CORE TEX actually has won a design award a couple of years ago as well.
Awesome. Congratulations there. So, if you wouldn't mind maybe, showing a couple little areas and maybe in a couple of the different forms or categories, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Right now?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Well, a lot of forms are obviously based on, start up here first, or based on just common things that we would see. So you have your pure sagittal plane.
You're going to have to bring it down just a little bit because you can't see the CORE TEX. A little bit more. There you go.
So as much as I love the product, not all my clients have it. So we actually give exercises that require no equipment at home at all, except
Beautiful.
maybe a bathrobe belt and maybe a pillow, and sure they have a foam roller. We can do some stuff with that as well. But before I go into the CORE TEX, if we were talking about, let's give an example of somebody that's in a lot of thoracic flexion, right? And let's say it's an older person, right? So let's say you have a senior citizen woman with the potential of osteoporosis, or at least she's got osteopenia, and you're certainly not going to put her on a foam roller and ask her to do that, right? But even some folks like that, you might notice if you try to lay them on a hard floor, even, okay, which by its nature uses their flexion as a fulcrum to help with extension, still uncomfortable and painful, right?
Yeah.
So if we did something like this, where we got on our hands and knees, right? See me okay?
Yep, perfect.
On our hands and knees, and then we imagine, so this is your grandmother right here, right? So she's on her hands and knees, and you imagine that we're on 4 pillars. And so the first thing you put anybody in this position, this is what they do. They kind of hold. Now, if I said, well, imagine on these 4 pillars that this was just like a hammock, and you're going to let it all settle down. So the only thing you're going to do is relax. You're going to exhale, let everything drop.
And your shoulder blades are coming together, and you're just
shoulder blades passively come together because the floor is pushing up.
Yep.
Basically, the weight of my internal organs is pulling me into passive extension, right? So that's the key, though. Actually, it's passive extension, and it's extension without having to force into it. So the more I breathe into it, the more I relax into it. The analogy would be, if you can't beat them, join them, right? Yep. So you just relax, and then you passively go into that extension, that position. Now. So again, think about it this way. Don't think about that as the end game. Think about that as somebody opening the door to the next exercise that you can do, right? Because now that I've relaxed that, now I can do something else. So I could potentially lay on the floor. If I were to take that same person and she was okay laying on her back. Now imagine this for a second. I do a very familiar butterfly, right? And I put my legs in that position, and everybody, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, it's a nice stretch of the adductors, right? But what else does it do? Because tension on the adductors, it actually will start to anteriorly tilt my pelvis. So it's going to put passive lumbar extension into my low back. So what does that do? Well, that actually improves the mechanical line of pull of my thoracic extensors. Because as soon as I get to a little lumbar, I get into thoracic. So now I'm here. All of a sudden, my pelvis is tipped forward a little bit. Oh, that feels kind of nice.
Now my thoracic spine, and now I can introduce a little bit more dynamic motion, like that facilitates, so as my hands pass overhead, the motion of my scapula asks my thoracic spine to do more, and now we're starting to introduce some extension without trying to slam somebody from here to here, where their body says,
and I love the, you know, the very small micro progressions, if you want to call them, that are happening here, as opposed to some people, maybe they get into a position and they make this big, huge jump, or maybe they ask them to do a prone cobra or something like that, that just against gravity, that might just be way too far of a jump. And then they try to do that, and then they scrap it. Oh, it hurts. So they scrap it, and they don't know how to kind of micro regress back down, which is fantastic.
Yeah, one of our pillars in our process and with our curriculum as well is we create what we call subroutines, which basically they're like little programs within little programs, and they do build on each other in the complexity of the exercises, like I was saying. And if you do that, you're reducing the threat, you're prepping the motor system and the psyche of the client for what's going to come next, right? You can't unring the bell if you go to an advanced exercise right off the bat, right? You got days, if not weeks, of trying to unwind that thing.
Yeah.
Right. So you just in a very strategic way, you just ascend that program.
And I think, you know, something else I think you're doing that maybe some people might not understand, especially if they just start doing it, is bringing attention to, you know, show them the exercise, let them do it, let them feel what they feel, ask them what they feel. And if it feels better, bring attention to that. So then again, that starts to get back into their mind that, oh my God, there is hope, you know, and so with some of these people that have pain, there's no hope. Like that's where they have. So I think those little itty bitty things are huge, huge impacts on retention of that client or referrals that client's going to give you, and at the end of the day, getting them results.
And you know, a lot of these principles, especially for the trainers that may not have clients in pain, but they don't move well at all, and that person really wants to move better. The principles are still the same.
Yep.
Right.
And they could be mobility exercises in the beginning, right? You could put them as, yep, that's fantastic.
Because you know, if this were even a client in pain that was moved through our process and they're doing significantly better and they want to get back to, you know, the driving range you know, for golf, we would have them do this right before they went out onto the driving range.
Got it.
So it's all a progression to get there.
Got it. So you showed one for more of that, a little bit more of the rounded shoulder forward head. Do you have anything in that lumbopelvic for that kind of anterior tilt-ish type posture that you might be able to show?
Sure. I'm gonna use the wall for this one.
Yep.
Okay? This is a kind of a, you know, if you thought about the first exercise that I gave you, it would be kind of if our exercises are A, B, C, and D exercises in terms of, again, neurological complexity, relationship to gravity. The first one I gave you would actually be kind of a B, letter B. The second one would be a letter A. This one would be a letter B too. So it's a little bit more than just kind of laying there isometric type stuff. But this is actually a version of a bridge or a hip bridge that we do on the floor. And the reason why we do it like this, because again, it's completely novel to the system. The only way you can execute it is by creating the opposite of the anterior tilt, but it also gives some feedback into the entire chain. So if I were not quite, can you see me okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, so if I was not quite at 90, meaning my buttocks is a little bit closer to the wall and my feet are down a little bit. So I'm almost, this is like I'm at the bottom of a squat, right? Now what I'm going to do here is my feet have to stay on the wall. So I get a little bit of that closed chain environment, okay? I'm not vertical to gravity, but at least I get a little bit of input from the bottoms of my feet. And then the cue is, I want you to lift your butt off the floor. It's not going to be very far and we don't need you to. So for me to get my butt off the floor, the only way I can do it is obviously I got to have a little bit of dorsiflexion range of motion, but the only way I can do it is my pelvis goes that way, right? So I get a little bit of posterior tilt, which I come back down and return, and then I go back up again. So at that point, what I've got to be able to do is I've got to have some control of the pelvic floor. I've certainly got to be able to have some control of that. But it's not like having somebody stand there and show me a pelvic tilt. It's by default that we're going to get there. And then as I go up, one of the more common things that we see with people with that anterior tilt is they get really gunked up, really gunked up at that thoracolumbar transition point, right?
And
So
real quickly, Anthony, when you say gunked up in thoracolumbar fascia areas, that kind of that lower back, if you're looking at a anatomical picture, it's kind of that clear diamond shape at the small of the back. But, can you explain what you mean by gunked up?
yeah, definitely not a clinical term there, right?
Yeah.
So as the lumbar spine is going this way into extension, and the bottom of the thoracic spine is starting to come out of flexion and starting to prepare, so that junction where those two meet, right? It's an area where the myofascial tissue and the ability for the layers of it to slide and glide. Somebody that's more this way, they have a bias in that transition. So the anterior tilt, the tissue is going to be biased in maintaining that. But we're trying to get that lumbar spine to flex a little bit, and that thoracic spine to relatively extend a little bit. We can create a little bit of space between that area. So gunked up just meaning that it's more closed down than it should be, or
And that's due,
capacity.
and that's due to the constant forces that are kind of placed in that particular area. Is that correct? Is that correct to say?
The adaptive changes to the tissue because of the prominence, right? Because they don't often. It's not asked. The body doesn't often ask it to do that. It stays more like that. So ultimately, we're not getting the ability for the layers of the connective tissue, the fascia to slide and glide, and the hydration, all the tissue in there, and that sort of thing. So by doing that, the motor control aspect of it is great, but we get the secondary benefit of creating space at that thoracolumbar junction by doing that with what we're doing, which again kind of hydrates that tissue. If we clear that gunk, then now the active tissue has less to work against to be able to achieve that motion as well.
Is it timed? Is it repetition number typically that you prescribe to be able to do that particular exercise?
In this particular exercise, we generally do it for reps because we do want that person to come down, come out of it, and go back. So if we went up and held it, and again, everything. I mean, the way we program it could be very specific, but if I went up and held it, then what would I be asking for? I'd be asking for sort of an isometric type hold and seeing if the tissue does it. And, part of what I move towards in some of these people that are really tight is not, when I say tight restricted, is more of gentle oscillating motions seem to have a very positive down-regulatory effect on the motor system that's contributing to unnecessary tone versus just mechanical changes in the tissue. And if we can do a little bit of that, we downregulate that, then things are more receptive to the change.
And it sounds, and if I'm wrong here, I know, a term that we always taught, or a concept that we always talked about with muscle activation technique was, the body reacts to a sense of either instability or tightness or overuse by tightening up. And when the body then senses stability, it will actually loosen up, very similar to if you're walking on ice, your body tightens up. And then when your body then, because you're sensing instability, but then once you get off that ice, you relax and your range of motion increases again and you're no longer. So is it a bit of maybe that's going on when you're slowly moving that through, the body's starting to sense more stability in your variability, and all of a sudden now you're able to have that range of motion and have it not be a worry that it might be injured?
Yeah, I definitely in line with that concept and agree with how the body will generally do it. When it comes to that principle, I think what it's doing is it's not quite going as far as providing the stability, which ultimately it needs, right? What it's doing is it's coming out their way of releasing the tension without taking them off the ice in the first place.
Yep.
So if I tightened up everything, but then you taught me to skate just a little bit, now I'm not nearly as tight. I don't have the stability I need, but at least I'm not, creating all this excessive overprotective tightness. So an oscillating motion can do that. Again, same thing. It's not the end game.
Yep.
It's like how can we sort of reboot that a little bit to open up a doorway or a path for us to move into the
well, and that's what that small, gentle, controlled motion is kind of that they're controlling is really the point that I was trying to make too, versus going at them and just hammering them and maybe, doing a hardcore stretch on them that might create that range, but maybe we're not stable within the range.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right that they're fully in charge of that, which makes the motor system say, I got this, right?
Got it.
I got this. I can understand. So I can send that proprioceptive input back in that interrupts that loop that's keeping all that tone in the first place.
Would you be able to show quick regression? Let's say somebody can't get into that particular position in the wall. How would you take that and just drop it maybe a little bit easier?
Well, I probably wouldn't do the same exercise, but I could do something. I would do something
Yeah,
similar.
something. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So if I were, this time I would go to 90 degrees. See, okay?
Yep.
So now I am at 90 degrees, right? So this is still a level A exercise for a person. And what I would do here is keeping the feet on the wall, pointing to the ceiling, but I'm going to rock out on the outside of my feet and then all the way back in. Right? So as I go through this motion, like a butterfly, just like on the floor, as my knees come apart, I get a little bit of an anterior tilt. As my knees come together, I get a little bit of a posterior tilt. Equally important, I've disassociated the motion of the hip from the pelvis, right? So I can go through these motions. So now the low back can relax. It's getting a little bit of input and feed because the deep rotators of the hip are intimately tied to the lumbodorsal fascia as well, right?
Yeah.
Now, again, gentle, oscillating, controlled, rhythmical motion down regulates that tone that ultimately has a positive impact onto the back.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, I appreciate that. I would love, for some people, maybe they've never even seen the CORE TEX, just to kind of show maybe some exercises, if we could stick with the same two concepts of, kind of that upper crossed and the lower crossed type issues, and what we can do with the CORE TEX. And, you might want to start with just letting people know how you kind of came up with it and what it's about.
Well, one of the driving principles of what we do, both with Function First and the CORE TEX, is variability, right? And with variability, whether it's heart rate variability, whether it's nutritional variability, whether it's social variability, certainly biomechanical and physiological variability are key aspects to how biological organisms thrive, right? Because otherwise we become accustomed to certain things. Any outside exposure to anything else like that leads us compromised, right? Because we can't handle that. And so, standing in a squat rec many years ago, realizing I'm just going to do another sagittal plane up and down motion, I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool if my hips did this? And then if my hips were doing this, if I was standing, ankles would be doing this, he would be doing this, and then the thoracic spine would be doing this. And then I could repeat that for 10 reps the same, different reps every time. And so that was sort of initially what we started thinking about. And the vision I had at the time was a skateboard in a bowl. And what we ended up with was where we have these 3-ball transfers. So it's like a 3-legged stool again, so you never lose contact. And we have the underside of the dome, so the angle of the ball transfers and the underside of the dome match up. And as a result, we get the only product that's out there that tilts. It tilts its time, and then because it's sitting on this ring, it has unrestricted rotation. So if you think about the combinations of available movements with that, it's almost infinite, right?
Yep.
All the things that I can do here. And so again, if I do 10 push-ups on this and add a little rotation, it's literally 10 different push-ups to both my hardware and my software. Right? My musculoskeletal system and my nervous system will be getting 10 different inputs each time. So if I were to take it in a traditional push-up, and very often when we think of liable or unstable surfaces, we think of stillness, right? And we're the opposite of that. We think of
I couldn't. It was hard to hear that. You said you think of what?
Most of the time, when we think about liable or unstable surfaces, the first thing that fitness pros and even rehab pros want to do is how do I produce stillness?
Okay, stillness.
Moves, right?
Okay, yeah.
And our philosophy is quite the opposite. We want to keep it moving. So we want that reactive variability and that dynamic stability that occurs with the motion. That doesn't mean we're certainly not for going bananas and doing stupid stuff. Hence the handrail. Hence the number of things that you can do that are ground based. Hence the number of things you can do with one leg on, one leg off, etc. But just as a quick example for the standard push up, if I take it down and I turn and I come back. I turn, based on the pressure that I apply to the platform, right? I'm going to get a different response, different stressors at the joints, different motor problems to solve every time is going to come up. To say the least, it's engaging, and because for so many people it's new. Again, something like this is going to certainly switch on a bunch of things that haven't been switched on.
Yeah, I think you're making that look very easy compared to what it actually would.
I've done my 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
If I could share with you, going back to the, if you think about the lower cross or just the sitting, right, and the tissue adaptation to that. Literally one of the most profound things with this that people don't think of, and what we've sold hundreds of them on based just is on the mobility aspect of it.
Yeah.
Right? So if you think hip flexors, so I'm on the CORE TEX right now, and the CORE TEX is centered, right? So it's not doing anything, it's pretty level. I'm going to move into a traditional hip flexor stretch, and I'm going to take the slack out of the tissue. So if you were a client, I'd say, do you feel that a little bit? Do you feel medium or a lot? About a medium. So I've taken the slack out of the tissue. With the slack out of the tissue now means that tissue is going to be sensitive to any changes, not just the sagittal plane, right? So I can take it back more and a little bit more sagittal, but I can also take it back in sagittal, then introduce some frontal, or I can take it and I can internally rotate and then go front to back. Or I could circumduct, or I could take it into my short adductors that are also hip flexors, right? So what am I doing again? My little gentle oscillation, down regulating the tissue, non-threatening, and the sense of mobility that you would get from that, it's off the charts.
Well, and people can't, I mean, sometimes it's hard for people to visualize what the hip is actually doing. And, there was so much little movement, but little movement up here creates a whole lot of movement down here. So that was cool.
Think about as a three-dimensional joint of ball and socket, think about how much attachment points and how many vectors they all work on, right? And what do? We do this, and then maybe we do this.
Yeah.
And if you're super advanced, you do this, right?
Yeah.
But that's still just three primary cardinal planes. There's a ton of spaces in between there that tissue runs that never ultimately gets addressed.
Yeah.
We know that any position the joint is, I could be in a certain position and some of the sarcomeres in my hip flexors are actually shortened while others are lengthened. So, if we really want to be efficient in our mobility, we're gonna hit it across all different vectors as much as we can. Since that's
awesome.
Really challenging and difficult to do on the floor and time consuming and more cognitively driven, we can get that response directly from, so whether that's my kneeling hip flexors, my hamstrings, whatever, we can do it all on that way.
That's awesome. Really cool, man. I really appreciate it. Anything else that you either want to show or that you want to, feed to the audience? Obviously, there's some education courses I'd love to talk about. There's the books and, obviously with lifetime people, we always like to help them out and potentially try to, see if they can get access to that stuff. Either it's a demo or at a discount or some things like that. And we could, put that stuff on the back end of this, but anything else that you want to show, that would be great.
Well, I would love to show, because we were talking about sitting. This is the next evil mad scientist thing I'm coming out with. It's in production right now. It's called the CORE TEX Sit, and basically it's for putting on any chairs, and it's going to create variability.
I need to get one of those right now.
And you just sit there and you can move around. I'll give you just a quick demo. I'm not super excited about this because of all the work from home stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Sits on a chair, get nice and centered, so I can be sitting here. I can take my hips through all these different motions, all these different vectors, whether it's purposeful, meaning that, okay, I'm going to do 10 this, or it's because I'm typing and my wife calls me and I turn this way. So again, it's all about taking that, stress and just spreading it out through micro movements.
When is that going to launch?
It should be out before Christmas.
Awesome. Cool. Congratulations.
We're in production right now.
Perfect. Well, Anthony, I can't thank you enough. I think there's some definite gems in there for some people. And obviously in an hour, we try to give you some value and some education of what you can take away. One thing I also want to say is, and you did a great job of talking about it, is we like to see exercise, and a lot of trainers like to see exercises, but there's a big thought process that's behind, why I'm selecting and when I'm selecting and how I'm doing it. And I don't want to discredit that by showing some exercise, but at the same time, I think, seeing some different exercises that they can do with people with issues maybe they've having issues with, and those exercises are pretty unique. I haven't seen much of those done, in the traditional educational manuals and things like that. Obviously, the CORE TEX is a whole nother level. Maybe we can have you back on and we'll do a bunch more education on the CORE TEX as people start hopefully grabbing those things. So,
That'd be awesome. That'd be
well,
awesome.
again, I really appreciate it. If you're in the San Diego area, I know we've got a couple of clubs now down in that area, or 1, 2-ish. Please, don't hesitate, or if you want to come up and check them out, that's great. But anything else you want to give to the audience?
Well, if anybody found the sort of the idea of how we prescribe exercises and found that intriguing, we do have an online curriculum. We have the pain-free movement specialist, which is we have levels 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is done online, and it is really focused on just how you work with people in chronic pain, the pain science behind it, assessments, and then the programming. And we've got that. That's actually doing really well all over the world right now with a bunch of different organizations that are helping us get it out there. And part of that is because pain is such a big thing. And
Yes, it is.
as you touched on in the beginning, I've said for years, I think there's so much more value for us as professionals to run our niche pretty narrow and deep versus trying to be all things to all people.
I agree. And, like I said, at the end of the day, I've always said it's easier once you know what you're doing. It's easier to help somebody get a little bit more pain-free than it is to get somebody to lose 35, 40 pounds. And, and if you can do those things, your referrals come in like they're crazy, and you will always be in business no matter what hits you, pandemic or not. So I can't thank you enough. And, there'll be some links to some of these courses, in the YouTube page, as well as anyone who's interested, that works at Lifetime. We'll talk to Anthony and we'll see what we can do to help you guys out, get some more education as well.
My pleasure, my friend. So
All right,
great to
man.
be doing this for everybody. I know it's an awesome service that's needed right now. Thank you.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too.